Hey guys, tonight we're heading to the wide, open fields of Wiltshire in southern England to examine Stonehenge, a prehistoric ring of standing stones whose siting and construction reflect deliberate choices about geology, transport, and horizon alignment. If you enjoy these geography stories, please give us a like and subscribe. Drop a comment to tell us where you're listening from. Your place may hold a story we can explore in a future episode. Before we get into it, take a moment to set your phone aside or adjust however you're listening. Get comfortable, whether that's lying back in bed, leaning into your favorite chair, or just closing your eyes for a while. No rush here, this story isn't going anywhere, and neither are the stones we're about to talk about. Stonehenge sits on a chalk plateau known as Salisbury Plain. The chalk provides a firm, well-draining substrate that is suited to deep sockets cut for heavy uprights. The plain's broad horizon allows unobstructed sight lines to the rising and setting points of the sun, and a nearby river corridor offers practical routes for movement. These geographic elements, bedrock, horizon, and corridor, combine to make the location suitable for a long-lived, visible monument. Archaeological evidence places the first substantial activity at the site around 3000 BCE. The initial phase consists of an encircling ditch and internal bank forming a henge. Within the interior, a ring of pits later named the Aubrey Holes was cut into chalk. Some of those early deposits contain cremated human remains, indicating mortuary use from an early date. The henge's axial orientation aligns with midsummer sunrise and midwinter sunset, suggesting that marking seasonal extremes was part of the site's spatial program. Over subsequent centuries, the site evolved. Timber settings occupied parts of the interior at certain moments. Evidence of repeated burning, feasting deposits, and articulated construction sequences indicate that the place served multiple functions and saw periodic reoccupation. Around 2500 BCE, construction entered a new phase with the introduction of large stone elements. Two main lithologies are present in the monument's fabric. Smaller blocks, commonly called bluestones, comprise igneous and metamorphic rocks whose mineral signatures match outcrops in distant upland zones. Larger blocks, the sarsens, are dense silicified sandstones taken from nearer rises. The combination of these materials provides signatures of both local sourcing and long-distance movement. Moving multi-ton stones over considerable distances required planning and materials. Ethnographic analogy and experimental archaeology show that sledges, rollers, and prepared trackways can reduce friction significantly, while waterways provide an efficient alternative for part of a journey. Teams hauling on greased timbers or sledges could coordinate labor with levers and stakes to negotiate slopes and stream crossings. At the destination, erecting an upright involved cutting deep sockets into chalk, levering the stone into place, and backfilling to secure it. Lintels were raised using earthen ramps and timber platforms, and then placed to interlock with mortise and tenon joinery carved into stone. Evidence of sophisticated knowledge of load and balance. The assembled plan creates interlocking frames. Uprights were placed in concentric arrangements and capped with lintels to form continuous structural rings. Specific stones, such as the heel stone, define sight lines to the horizon. The entrance and central axis align on solstitial extremes. A society attentive to seasonal cycles could read those positions as markers for calendrical events. The spatial ordering also organizes movement and viewing, producing an architecture that ties people on the ground to the turning sky. Excavations and survey work reveal that Stonehenge is part of a larger ceremonial landscape. The avenue is a linear earthwork that links the circle to the River Avon, forming a processional way that connects water routes and inland settings. Downton Walls, a short distance away, yields evidence of substantial seasonal aggregation with domestic architecture, hearths, pottery, and large-scale food processing consistent with communal gatherings. Long barrows and round barrows, cursus monuments, and other enclosures pepper the surrounding plains, marking both funerary practice and movement across the terrain. The material record preserves traces of labor and technique. Antler picks and flint tools used to cut chalk ditches remain in situ in sealed contexts. Dressing marks on sarsen surfaces show deliberate working to shape sockets and tenons. Petrographic analysis of bluestones identifies source regions, while isotopic work on human remains indicates non-local origins for some buried individuals. These data points build a picture of a site that required specialized skills, long-distance connections, and sustained communal investment. Post-depositional processes and later human activity also shape what we observe. Freeze-thaw weathering, biological colonization, and soil movement have altered stone surfaces and sockets. Medieval and post-medieval accounts record antiquarian interest and occasional removal or repurposing of stones. By the time modern archaeology began systematic study, some uprights had fallen and been reused. Others were missing. Early modern sketchers provided measurements and plans that later investigators used to reconstruct phases of the monument. Interpretation has shifted over time from myth-driven accounts to processual reconstruction informed by stratigraphy, dating, and sourcing. Medieval writers invented origins, attributing movement of stones to wizards or giants. But modern researchers focus on logistics, landscape selection, and ritual practice. The absence of written records means many functional aspects remain debated. The specifics of ritual performance, the social structures that mobilized labor, and the reasons for selective reconfiguration. The combination of geological suitability, clear sight lines, and access to movement corridors explains why this particular rise on Salisbury Plain hosted repeated episodes of construction. Further excavations continue to refine the sequence and context of those alterations. By the post-medieval period, Stonehenge had already attracted speculation and legend. Antiquarians in the 17th and 18th centuries measured and sketched the stones, producing plans that recorded dimensions and fall positions before later restorations altered profiles. Figures such as Inigo Jones and subsequent surveyors interpreted the monument through the assumptions of their times, sometimes proposing classical or historicizing origins. Their measurements and drawings, however imperfect by modern standards, preserved data that later researchers could reassess. Fieldwork accelerated in the 19th and 20th centuries. Systematic excavations recovered stratified deposits within ditch fills, located cremation burials, and retrieved tools such as antler picks used to cut chalk. Radiocarbon dating anchored sequences into absolute time frames, showing that major construction episodes cluster across centuries. Geophysical surveying techniques extended observation beyond trenches, mapping buried features that inform landscape-scale models without intrusive excavation. These combined methods transformed interpretation from speculation to processual reconstruction grounded in stratigraphy and material science. One significant development was recognition of Stonehenge as part of a wider ceremonial complex. The avenue, the River Avon corridor, Dighton walls, and multiple barrows and cursus monuments form a network of interrelated places. Dighton walls, in particular, yields evidence of large-scale seasonal occupation and mass consumption. Faunal assemblages show concentrated butchery and consumption of domestic animals, interpreted as evidence for communal feasting linked to assembly and ritual. When seen as a system, the plain reads as a mapped landscape of movement between domestic aggregation points and ritual locales, mediated by visible sightlines and processional ways. Technological advances refined provenance and mobility studies. Petrographic and geochemical sourcing of bluestone lithologies tied specific rock types to upland outcrops. Isotopic analysis of human remains revealed non-local origins for some individuals associated with the monument. These findings indicate that communities engaged in movement and exchange across substantial distances, and that people from diverse locales participated in practices connected to Stonehenge. Such evidence expands conceptions of Neolithic Britain to include broader regional networks and episodic mobility. The 20th century introduced both conservation imperatives and contentious moments. Growing public interest and tourist visitation placed pressure on the site. Earlier souvenir collecting and physical interference damaged surfaces and removed context. In response, preservation measures were implemented. Stabilization work planned in the early 20th century re-erected fallen stones and protected vulnerable uprights, sparking debates about intervention versus authenticity. Later approaches favored minimal, reversible measures backed by detailed documentation and monitoring. Conservation approaches evolved with technology. Non-invasive geophysical techniques allow monitoring of subsurface conditions and stone deterioration without intrusive trenching and enable landscape scale mapping. Laser scanning and photogrammetric recording produce high-resolution models that capture dressing marks, joinery, and microtopography. These digital records support both conservation planning and research into construction techniques by preserving exact surface geometries for analysis. Public management and visitor policy also matured. The transition of ownership into public stewardship established frameworks for protection and interpretation, and the site's designation under international heritage conventions directed coordinated conservation and research investment. Visitor infrastructure was developed to balance access and preservation. Controlled approach routes, interpretive exhibits, and regulated event policies aim to reduce wear while providing context. Educational programming and community engagement were incorporated into management strategies to build civic support for stewardship. Scholarly debates diversified alongside methods. Some researchers foreground the monument's role as an astronomical marker that facilitated calendrical observance. Others emphasize funerary practice and social signaling. Still others view it within models of social cohesion produced by communal labor. Increasingly, pluralist perspectives accommodate multiple, evolving uses. A site that hosted seasonal assemblies, performed funerary rites, and served as a territorial focus at different times. The absence of contemporary texts necessitates synthesis of material, spatial, and environmental data to generate testable models rather than single explanatory narratives. Recent landscape-scale projects seek to contextualize Stonehenge within environmental and land use histories. Pollen analyses, sediment sampling, and soil micromorphology reconstruct vegetation clearance, pasture regimes, and hydrological shifts that affected visibility and access. Modeling of movement corridors and erosion dynamics informs understanding of how processional approaches functioned and how seasonal conditions shaped human use. The integration of environmental data with archaeological surveys shifts interpretation from isolated monument to dynamic, lived landscape. In recognition of its significance, Stonehenge and its associated landscape received coordinated heritage protection and international attention, prompting expanded conservation funding and research collaboration. Management today involves agencies tasked with balancing archaeological inquiry, visitor experience, and ecosystem health. Outreach programs engage local communities, schools, and volunteers in monitoring and interpretation projects, opening avenues for shared custodianship and participatory research. Fieldwork and stewardship continue across seasons and years to protect, study, and interpret this enduring place. These cumulative studies shifted public and scholarly perception of Stonehenge from isolated curiosity to locus within a dynamic ritual and social terrain. The monument's meaning emerges through the intersection of landscape selection, labor investment, material sourcing, and repeated human practice rather than from a single origin story. The 20th and 21st centuries have been eras of sustained inquiry, conservation, and public engagement at Stonehenge. Systematic excavations initiated in the early 1900s established stratigraphic sequences and recovered artifacts that clarified multiple construction phases. Radiocarbon dating and typological study refined chronologies, demonstrating that the monument's principal episodes unfolded over many generations rather than in a single campaign. Geophysical survey methods expanded the observable record by mapping buried features across the plain and guiding targeted investigation. Detailed material studies linked components of the monument to specific geological sources. Petrographic analysis connects several bluestone types to outcrops in the Preseli Hills of southwest Wales, while large sarsen blocks match local rises on the Marlborough Downs. These sourcing results imply coordinated movement, the use of river corridors and prepared trackways, and significant communal investment in staging and transport. Isotopic studies of human remains recovered near the monument indicate that some individuals associated with Stonehenge were non-local, pointing to mobility, exchange, or pilgrimage networks that linked distant places to the Salisbury landscape. Work on the surrounding plain reframes Stonehenge as part of an integrated ceremonial and domestic terrain. Dynton Walls, situated northeast of the circle, contains structural remains interpreted as seasonal households and communal spaces. Faunal assemblages there show concentrations of butchered animal bone consistent with large communal feasts. The avenue aligns the circle with the River Avon, suggesting a planned procession that used water and land approaches in sequence. Scattered barrows and cursus monuments produce a palimpsest of mortuary, ceremonial, and movement features across the plain. Conservation and site management present continuous operational demands. Recognition under international heritage conventions has mobilized funding and coordinated protection, but increased visitor numbers require careful management of access. Stabilization projects address structural risks to leaning uprights, while monitoring programs track biological colonization, salt crystallization, and mechanical abrasion on stone surfaces. Contemporary conservation emphasizes minimal, reversible interventions informed by rigorous documentation. Digital recording, including laser scanning and photogrammetry, produces datasets that support virtual analysis and long-term condition monitoring. Public interpretation and community engagement form central elements of stewardship. Visitor centers supply contextual exhibits, audio guides, and carefully designed approach routes that reduce direct impact on the monument. Educational outreach invites schools and volunteers to participate in monitoring and interpretive programming, and open-access research repositories enable scholars worldwide to analyze finds and survey results. Community archaeology projects involve residents in mapping and oral history recording, strengthening links between local knowledge and academic research. Environmental monitoring supports long-term maintenance. Sensor networks record moisture regimes, temperature variations, and biological activity on stone surfaces, allowing conservators to identify emerging risks and test mitigation strategies. Studies of lichen colonization, microbial activity, and salt efflorescence inform cleaning protocols and protective measures. Landscape-scale paleo-environmental reconstructions using pollen cores, sediment analysis, and soil micromorphology reveal vegetation histories and hydrological changes that influenced ceremonial use and access routes over millennia. Methodological diversification enhances interpretive power. Airborne LiDAR and high-resolution photogrammetry reveal subtle earthworks and prehistoric trackways not visible at ground level. Magnetometry and resistivity surveys map subsurface anomalies that guide targeted sampling while limiting disturbance. Three-dimensional scanning preserves microscopic tooling marks and surface where patterns that inform reconstructions of dressing techniques and jointing methods. Computational models, including agent-based simulations, investigate plausible organizational structures for labor, transport logistics, and seasonal scheduling. Comparative and interdisciplinary research situates Stonehenge within broader patterns of megalithic practice. Similarities in monument siting, horizon alignment, and communal investment appear across Atlantic Europe, suggesting convergent solutions to shared geographic constraints. Cross-regional comparison links Stonehenge to passage graves, henge monuments, and stone circles in Ireland, Brittany, and Iberia, prompting questions about networks of shared practice and the diffusion of ritual and construction knowledge. Such perspectives encourage study of technological exchange as well as shared symbolic forms. Scholarly debates remain active. Some frameworks emphasize astronomical calibration and seasonal marking. Others prioritize funerary performance, territorial signaling, or social cohesion engineered through communal labor. Increasingly, pluralist models accommodate multiple, shifting uses across generations. The lack of textual records requires scholars to synthesize material, spatial, and environmental evidence into testable hypotheses that can be evaluated through targeted excavation, comparative study, and modeling. Future priorities emphasize expanded peripheral mapping, improved non-invasive compositional and isotopic analyses, and strengthened collaboration with communities and stakeholders. Broader geophysical surveys aim to identify ancillary activity areas and refine movement models, while advances in isotopic and compositional techniques will provide finer provenance data. Conservation planning increasingly integrates climate projections to anticipate how changing moisture regimes and freeze-thaw cycles may affect stone and socket stability. Collaborative projects that pair specialist laboratories with local partners aim to produce research that is scientifically rigorous and socially accountable. Legal protections and heritage recognition have shaped the monument's current trajectory. Designations under national heritage frameworks and inscription on international registers formalize conservation obligations and create management structures. These frameworks fund monitoring, enable coordinated research, and guide visitor access. Management policies have evolved in response to past conflicts over use and access, producing procedures that balance ceremonial access, public visitation, and long-term preservation. Acoustic and sensory studies add further dimensions to interpretation by investigating whether stone placement affected sound propagation and how sensory experience may have factored into ritual practice. Agent-based and labor modeling refine estimates of workforce organization and test scenarios for coordinated stone movement. These interdisciplinary methods illustrate how technological, social, and environmental data combine to produce richer accounts of past practice. Stonehenge's value lies in its capacity to generate sustained, testable inquiry into prehistoric social organization, technology, and landscape practice. Its stones, ditches, and avenues preserve evidence of site selection, long-distance movement, construction technique, repeated use, and modification. As research progresses, the monument continues to anchor multidisciplinary study into how people engaged with river corridors, chalk plains, and celestial horizons. Now, as you prepare to rest, picture those fields at dusk. The stones standing dark against a cooling sky, paths running toward river and ridge, and the long accumulation of human work embedded in chalk and rock. Hold that image quietly and let the plain's steady presence ease the day's edges. May your dreams follow gentle horizons until morning light returns to your bedside. Sleep well and good night. Hi guys. Tonight we're traveling to the North Atlantic to ask a simple question with a complicated history. Why did a respected mapmaker leave Iceland off a map, erasing a nation with a stroke of ink? If you enjoy slow geography stories and want more, please like and subscribe, and drop a comment with where you're listening from. Before we start, take a moment to settle in. Let the muscles in your face loosen. Let your shoulders drop a little, and find a comfortable breath. You don't have to picture anything. Just let the pace slow. We'll stay with facts and we'll give them room. To understand how an island as substantial as Iceland could vanish from a map, we step into the 16th century, when maps were not fixed truths but arguments drawn on parchment. Cartographers worked with what they could gather. Sailors' journals, port records, hearsay, older charts copied and recopied, and the occasional personal observation. The North Atlantic in that era was a tangle of reports. Some were precise, others vague, some contradictory, and many wrapped in old names inherited from classical texts and medieval lore. Iceland was not unknown. Norse sources describe settlement beginning in the late 9th century, with farms along fjords, and a Lingi meeting at Ingvellir, and trade reaching Norway, England, and the Hanseatic ports. Medieval manuscript maps, the Mapmaker, place northern islands in stylized ways, and by the early 1500s Portland-style charts often showed a recognizable Iceland. But recognition was not the same as certainty. Distances were poorly measured, coastlines distorted by projection and guesswork, and the weather hid landmarks for weeks at a time. On a desk far from the sea, it could be safer to doubt than to assert. Then came a fresh layer of confusion. Phantom Islands. The Zeno map of 1558 popularized Friesland, a large island placed south or southwest of Iceland, and it lingered on many maps for more than a century. Classical authors had also mentioned Thule, a far northern land that later readers tried to match to real coasts. Add fog, magnetic declination, floating ice, and volcanic glow on the horizon, and you have conditions ripe for misidentification. In this climate, even conscientious scholars sometimes questioned what earlier pilots swore was true. That doubt sits at the heart of our story. In the mid-16th century, a European globe maker produced a North Atlantic that showed Britain and Greenland, but, in at least one edition, left no space for Iceland. The omission was not a smudge or a missing label. The gore, the printed panel that wraps a segment of the globe, simply sailed past where the island should have been. Was it an editorial choice born of skepticism? Were the sources used for that gore treating Friesland as the real island and pushing Iceland out of frame? Or did the workshop withhold uncertain features to avoid misleading readers who would navigate by the finished product? It helps to remember how knowledge moved. A single respected map could guide pilots and schoolrooms for decades. If a feature appeared confidently, copyists reproduced it. If it was left off, caution rippled outward. Iceland's contacts with Europe, English and German merchant voyages for cod and stockfish, Danish administration, Lutheran clergy sailing north were real and regular. Yet a mapmaker working far from those harbors might trust engraved authority over scattered reports and leave the island unmarked. This was not just a problem of one workshop. The 16th century saw a tug-of-war between encyclopedic atlases and regional specialists. Olaus Magnus' 1539 Carta Marina offered a rich, if theatrical, view of the North with marginal notes, sea creatures, and erupting volcanoes. Abraham Ortelius, publishing his great atlas in 1570, placed Islandia with a careful synthesis of names and shapes available to him, while still echoing older lore. Others leaned harder on caution. Without telescopes, without reliable longitude at sea, and without consistent coastal surveys, the safest editorial move was sometimes to simplify. Silence on a map carries weight. From merchants seeking contracts, scholars debating ancient texts, or statesmen imagining distant claims, what did not appear seemed less real. That is the practical meaning of erasure here. The farms on Iceland's south coast still stood. The Lingi still met. Fishermen set lines in cold seas. But in the symbolic world of lines, an island could fade between editions, and with it the sense, from afar, that it mattered. There were technical pressures too. Engraving space was finite. Globe gores forced compromises where narrow triangles meet at the poles. Crowded seams invited simplification. If a source wavered, an engraver might drop a label to keep the surface clean. When two islands were reported in roughly the same place, say Iceland and the alleged Friesland, one might be favored to avoid clutter. A cautious editor might promise to restore the doubtful feature later, after better reports arrived. Some did, and some never got the chance. The irony is that Iceland, geologically young and lively, rarely conforms to outsiders' expectations. The island straddles the mid-Atlantic ridge, rift valleys, shield volcanoes, glaciers fed by North Atlantic storms, and frequent earthquakes shape coasts and river mouths. Harbors shift, sandbars grow and vanish in winter gales. A sailor who first approached on a hazy day could return with a sketch that disagreed with a neighbor's drawing from a clear summer. Multiply that by decades, and a desk in Antwerp or Venice receives mutually confident charts that do not match. Still, the people who lived there did not doubt their island. Law codes, sagas, parish lists, and ship manifests tie the place firmly to the world. That is the tension at the core of tonight's topic. Lived certainty against remote skepticism. A pen stroke in a city far away could not change reality on the ground, but it could shape what distant readers believe to be real. That is how an omission turns into a story worth telling and worth correcting. The North Atlantic did not stay blank for long. Printers learned quickly, and readers compared editions. Where one globe omitted Iceland, a later state restored it, sometimes with a new outline and a note explaining the source. That pattern, omission, debate, correction was common in an age when every coastline was under negotiation. Regional expertise pushed the restoration forward. In 1539, Olaus Magnus published the Carta Marina, a large woodcut map that placed Iceland prominently and filled the northern seas with marginal notes. 3 decades later, the Antwerp Circle around Abraham Ortelius assembled a clearer Islandia, drawing on northern sources and correspondence. Among those sources were Icelanders themselves. The work of Guðbrandur Orlsson, a learned bishop who cultivated astronomical and geographic studies, helped shape a more faithful outline and a more reliable set of toponyms. By the 1590s, Ortelius could print an Iceland plate that, while decorated in the manner of its day, anchored the island in the right neighborhood with the right neighbors. Even with better outlines, uncertainty persisted offshore. The Zeno maps Friesland refused to disappear. Late 16th and early 17th century atlases often showed both Iceland and Friesland side by side, a graphic admission that compilers did not yet feel secure enough to erase either. Only when more voyages crisscrossed the North Atlantic without sighting the Phantom did editors find the confidence to drop Friesland and let Iceland stand alone. Consider the instruments behind these decisions. Latitude was measurable by the height of the sun or familiar stars above the horizon, which navigators could do with cross-staff, astrolabe, or backstaff. Longitude at sea remained elusive until the 18th century because it required precise timekeeping. In the 16th century, dead reckoning and guesswork filled the gap. On paper, that produced long east-west errors, which could shove islands into the wrong meridians or make them crowd each other. Add the distortion of early projections and you have a toolbox designed, unintentionally, to manufacture disagreement. Weather strengthened the effect. Iceland sits where cold and mild air masses meet. Storm tracks sweep through, shoving sea ice south some years and not others. Volcanic plumes can rise through cloud and haze, and ashfall can dull the light for days. In such conditions, a lookout could confuse white surf on a distant skerry with the line of a far shore, or a cap of fog with a glacier. A logbook entry made under those conditions, faithfully copied by a clerk, could travel to a mapmaker's bench and become a coastline. Printing practice also mattered. Globe gores were engraved as discrete panels. Wall maps were assembled from multiple plates. A correction on one plate might not reach a partner plate before an edition deadline. When an engraver reworked a crowded North Atlantic, an island could slip because a label failed to fit or because a source list ranked it as doubtful. Surviving copies show these editorial seams. One state labeling havens and capes in careful Latin, the next state thinning the furniture to make room for a bolder outline, another moving an island north by a finger's width. To a buyer at a bookstall, each looked authoritative. To us, the differences tell a story about how quickly knowledge evolved. Meanwhile, people on Iceland watched strangers' maps with a mixture of curiosity and impatience. Merchants in Hafnarfur or Saftrur knew the shape of their harbors by sound and habit. Clergy tracked parish boundaries, sea routes, and safe landings as part of their pastoral rounds. Letters traveled to Copenhagen and northern Germany with updates on eruptions, fishing grounds, and ship losses. When those letters finally influenced printed maps, locals could see familiar names spread beyond the island's shores. Yet the stakes were larger than pride. Map images shaped policy. If a crown's advisors believed the northern sea to be largely empty, they might neglect light dues, pilotage, or rescue. If an atlas highlighted an island's harbors, investors might charter new voyages. Diplomatically, clean outlines could harden claims. The more confidently Iceland sat in the publishing centers of Europe, the more its reality became part of political common sense. Scholars contributed in quieter ways. Humanist editors compared ancient texts with sailors' reports, arguing about whether these northern islands matched classical names or belonged in a newer geography entirely. Natural philosophers gathered observations of magnetic variation and currents that gradually made charts less erratic. In Northern Europe, university lecturers and learned clergy taught basic astronomy, encouraging better measurement of latitude on land and at sea. All of this moved slowly, but it moved. By the early 17th century, major atlases presented Iceland consistently, even if sea monster vignettes and cartouches still crowded the margins. Dutch houses like Blauw and Hondius absorbed practical intelligence from pilots who had rounded the island and wintered in its ports. Descriptions improved, capes and skerries stabilized, and the room on the page reserved for Friesland shrank. The story of the map that erased Iceland stands in that light as a snapshot of a transition. In one frame, caution and confusion convince an engraver to omit a label and let the gore pass blank. In the next frame, correspondents supply better material. A new state of the map appears with an island restored, its outline adapted and its place secured among neighbors. It is not a tale of malice. It is a tale of how doubt, printing, weather, instruments, and sources all conspired to make and unmake coastlines on paper. Writers helped too. Arngrimur Johnson's early 17th century descriptions circulated a sober account of the island's climate, society, and hazards, pushing back against extravagant tales. Pilots in the Dutch and English whaling trades sketched approaches to Westford's anchorages and marked dangerous skerries at the mouths of bays. Although many of these working charts remained unpublished, their information filtered into atlases by way of editors who bought or borrowed notebooks. Step by cautious step, text and trace work turned a once doubted island into a fixture modern readers would simply take for granted. Indeed, by the 18th century, the broad outline of Iceland stabilized in print, but precision came slowly. European scholars became more skeptical of phantom islands, and editors pruned Friesland from new plates, yet detailed coastal knowledge still depended on local expertise. Harbors shifted with storms, rivers braided and moved their mouths, and sandbars complicated approaches to shallow bays. Compilers needed measurements taken on the ground. One path to improvement ran through the Danish crown, which administered Iceland. Officials gathered reports from magistrates and clergy, encouraged better latitude observations, and circulated inquiries about harbors and crossings. Another path ran through science. Astronomy, Surveying and geodesy matured together. Triangulation networks spread through Europe, and instrument makers delivered better quadrants and theodolites to anyone with training. Although many islands waited until the 19th century for full triangulated surveys, the expectation that coastlines could be measured rather than guessed reshaped the cartographic imagination. The long-term hinge for Iceland's mapping was a homegrown one. During the first half of the 19th century, the mathematician and teacher Björn Gunnlaugsson produced a survey that pulled place names, bearings, and distances into a coherent whole. Published in the 1840s as Uppdrættir Islands, his map gave readers a measured island, made by a resident who knew its roads, ferries, ridges, and reefs. Though later surveys would refine his work, the achievement replaced centuries of debate with a disciplined image that others could test and improve. After that, detail multiplied. Harbor charts received soundings. Travel narratives and gazetteers synchronized with maps. Photographers documented farmsteads and passes, and pilots wrote practical notes about winds and lee shores. When aviation arrived in the 20th century, aerial photography accelerated updates, and the Danish Geodetic Institute and Icelandic authorities compiled new series to match the modern needs of shipping, planning, and civil defense. Geology gave cartographers even more to do. Volcanic systems from Great Chains to the Central Highlands put fresh lava on the ground in different centuries, and glaciers advanced and retreated with climate variations. Eruptions such as Katla's in the 19th century and Hekla's recurrent activity sent ash across fields and sea, darkening ice and changing melt. Coastal charts responded, trimming promontories where erosion bit and adding hazards where new shoals formed. In 1963, when Surtsey broke the ocean surface south of Jaime, Iceland literally grew in front of surveyors' eyes. Aircraft photographed the newborn island repeatedly, and map plates changed as the cone inflated, slumped, and stabilized. On paper, you can watch land appear, weather, and take its place among older neighbors. All of this context reframes the earlier omission. That 16th century blank space was not just an error. It was a window into how knowledge is made, through networks of reports, editorial priorities, and the limits of tools. Maps teach by what they leave out as much as by what they show. A missing island, a misdrawn cape, an uncorrected name. Each marks a crossroads where someone chose between competing stories. When Iceland re-enters European maps with confidence, you can see the result of many kinds of labor. There are the obvious contributions, the surveys, the engravings, the print runs carried to bookshops, and the hidden ones. A parish clerk who kept a careful list of farms, a pilot who explained a tricky current, a teacher who convinced a pupil to measure properly instead of guessing. Together they replace the temptation to erase with the discipline to revise. Modern tools do not end that process. They make it faster. Satellite imagery outlines glaciers and lava fields. GPS fixes positions that older logbooks wobbled. LiDAR traces beach ridges and old shorelines across the lowlands. But editors still decide what belongs on a sheet scaled for hikers or a chart scaled for mariners. A cartographer tasked with a tiny inset still trims and simplifies, and a dataset still omits features that fall below a threshold. Every clean, readable map is the result of many careful removals. That is why the story of the missing Iceland keeps its bite. It reminds us that absence on paper can have consequences beyond paper. In an age when borders, resources, and hazards often depend on what databases draw and what they ignore, the old lesson holds. Skepticism is healthy, but so is the obligation to check. On the day, a cautious editor left an island off a gore. There were farmers hauling driftwood on southern beaches and boats beating into wind along the west fords. Reality was busy while the page wavered. The page recovered. New editions restored the island. Later surveys improved it. And atlases taught generations to picture Iceland as a sturdy shape between Greenland and Norway. Now the island appears in schoolrooms, weather maps, and airline screens without a second thought. Some maps still get details wrong. A road misplaced, a spelling outdated, but the broad frame holds. In that stability lies a quiet tribute to everyone who replaced uncertainty with measurement and myth with observation. If you strip the story down to essentials, it follows a human rhythm. Hear a claim, compare it with experience, test it, and then redraw. Maps just make that rhythm visible. When you open a modern atlas and see Iceland sitting exactly where you expect it, you are looking at a century-spanning conversation resolved to a line. In archives and museums, you can trace the steps. Early plates with crowded seas sit beside cleaner later states. Handwritten corrections share drawers with engraved ones. Facsimiles of Updratter Islands hang near modern sheets, inviting viewers to compare decisions across time. The display reminds us that accuracy is built, maintained, and always open to one more careful check. And now, after all the names and coastlines, let the room be dim and calm. Let your breath ease. Imagine the quiet shape of an island on a page, set solidly in its sea, and the steady work that kept it there. May the world feel mapped enough for rest, and may the routes you carry through the night bring you gently to morning. Good night. Hi everyone. Tonight we go inland from the coast to a place where the sky meets a white plain so perfectly that, to early observers, it read as water. If you like these geography stories, please hit the like and subscribe button, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Your landscape just might be the subject of the next episode. Before we begin the story, settle in. Listen for the thin hiss of wind. Imagine the flat air above a plain that throws sound forward, or picture a gull's cry carried across a dry sea of salt. Let that open, wide hush set the shape for what you're about to hear. In the late 18th century, Spanish expeditions pushed northward from what is now New Mexico into the broad interior of the continent. One of those journeys, led in 1776 by Fathers Francisco Atanasio Dominguez and Silvestre Velez de Escalante, aimed to find a practicable overland route from Santa Fe toward the missions on the Pacific coast. Their journal records the realities of travel across mountains and deserts, and it also preserves the conversations and the names that guides and native informants used for unfamiliar features in the landscape. On several occasions, they heard of a vast silver lake lying beyond certain ridgelines, described in local speech as a broad, gleaming surface that held the horizon. When the expedition approached the western basins, they found surfaces that flashed like water in the sun, and their reports used language that mapped easily onto the European idea of inland seas. Their accounts, and the maps produced by their cartographer Bernardo de Mira y Pacheco, circulated among colonial officials and printers and influenced how the region was represented in European atlases. That influence is important to understand. In the pre-satellite era, maps were compilations of reports. A scribe in Mexico City might copy a priest's diary, a mariner's sketch, or a trader's anecdote. When a respected cartographer produced a plate showing Laguna de los Timpanogos, or a broad western inland sea, that image traveled far faster in the printed world than on the ground. Bernardo de Mira's 1778 chart of northern New Spain, for example, placed a large bay or lake configuration in the western basins, an interpretation that made sense if one combined scattered testimony with the visual effect of salt plains reflecting a clouded sky. To readers who could not travel for verification, the map resolved ambiguity. It asserted a geography by authority as much as by observation. Why would a salt plain look like water? The answer is geology and optics. The Bonneville Basin, which once held Lake Bonneville at the end of the last ice age, contains extremely flat expanses of evaporite minerals. Lake Bonneville at its high stand covered tens of thousands of square miles, leaving shoreline benches and terraces at specific elevations across western Utah and eastern Nevada. Over time, as climate warmed and the lake contracted in stages, the Provo and Bonneville oscillations are recorded in shoreline terraces. The water receded and left behind a locus of salts and fine sediments. The exposed flats develop a smooth, continuous surface of halite and other minerals that reflect light in a way similar to an open water surface when the air is still and the sun is low. Geological studies, notably the comprehensive monographs of Grove Carl Gilbert and later U.S. Geological Survey work, document the lake's former extents and explain why the modern relics can fool the eye at a distance. Those geological truths undercut, but do not erase, the practical reasons explorers mistook salt for lake. From a sled or horseback, when the plane is over a light film of water or under certain angles of incident light, it produces the same specular reflection as standing water. Mirages and atmospheric refraction heighten the effect. The temperature gradient just above the salt crust bends light, producing a shimmering sheet on the horizon that reads as a surface. With no accurate method of fixing longitude and with latitude measurements that could be thrown off by poor observations, a distant stripe of shimmer could be plotted as a coastline by an eager cartographer. When these reports aggregated, they produced durable map images. A large lake in a place where, in truth, only salt lay. It matters that these were not isolated verbal mistakes. The Spanish presence in the interior at the time was limited, and the flow of information was slow. One expedition's observation might be repeated without the context of seasonal change. A spring puddle after heavy runoff could appear permanent to a traveler moving during wet years. In decades of drier climate, the same spot would be an arid salt pan. The differential between episodic water and long-term dryness is central to the historical confusion. A single wet year, seen from a ridge, could be transcribed into a lasting label on a printed plate. The cartographic effect grew when European atlases copied each other. An image engraved by a respected workshop became a source for other printers and mapmakers. An errant lake could propagate for decades. For the Dominguez Escalante expedition and for later readers of Mira's work, the reflective salt plain and the name-carrying oral testimony combined to produce what reads, to us now, like an understandable mistake. Salt read as sea, plain read as lake, typography read as cartographic certainty. From that moment at the plain's edge, with priests and guides standing over a whitened crust that caught the sun, the story of a lake to sail entered the map-making stream. The journals moved to print, the print moved to other atlases, and the idea of a navigable inland sea west of the Great Salt Lake became part of the colonial record. But the underlying geology remained. A desiccated former lake bed with salts, playas, and the broad, level expanse that can, under particular light, lie like a silver mirror across the earth. The narrative continues without a tidy end because the map's consequences, misplaced hope, corrected charts, altered colonial planning, unfolded over decades and through many expeditions that followed behind those first priests and cartographers. Maps altered slowly, and correction often required focused reconnaissance. As the 19th century advanced, additional parties of trappers, army surveyors, and civilian explorers moved into the basins. Figures such as John C. Fremont and, more systematically, Captain Howard Stansbury of the U.S. Army's Corps of Topographical Engineers led expeditions whose instruments and scopes were larger than the scattered reports of the 18th century. Stansbury's careful survey of the Great Salt Lake Basin, published in 1852, combined topographic observation with soundings and triangulation that helped to clarify where water actually lay and where the flats were dry. His maps and later Corps surveys reduced the room for myth by specifying shorelines and by measuring heights above sea level that tied putative lakes to real, stable terraces. Scientific geologists also entered the discussion with methods suited to long-term change. Grove Carl Gilbert's late 19th century monograph on Lake Bonneville is foundational. Gilbert synthesized field observation, sediment profiles, and geomorphology to map the lake's high stands and to explain how its desiccation produced the modern pattern of basins, playas, and salt pans. His work demonstrated that what an earlier observer might see as a lake was often a strandline remnant or a temporary shallow pooling over a largely dry substrate. Gilbert's analysis reframed sections of the Great Basin as a record of Pleistocene hydrology rather than as ongoing, static inland seas. Field reports from trappers and early settlers offered a human contrast to the maps and geology. Mountain men moving with beaver, fur, and mule trains described the salt crust's giving and hardness. The pan would sometimes bear a loaded wagon. At other times, the same surface would sink into brackish mud after thaw. These practical observations found their way into regional journals and into the mapping process. Cartographers who prioritized first-hand, seasonally varied reports gradually corrected older plates that had assumed permanence. By the later 19th century, the era of phantom navigable lakes across the interior was coming to a close. The Bonneville salt flats themselves became an object of targeted study in the 20th century. Agencies monitored crust thickness, salt loss, and hydrologic behavior. Records show the crust's thickness varying over time, with human extraction and groundwater pumping affecting the mass balance of surface salts. Scientists measured salt crust decline in the latter half of the 20th century and investigated processes of salt transport, wind deflation, and episodic flooding that complicate any simple picture of a static surface. These studies clarified that while the plain's surface can sometimes be smoothed by brief floods that create shallow reflective water, the deeper hydrology does not amount to a continuous inland sea but to a dynamic, mostly dry playa with localized brines and ephemeral ponds. Cartographic practice adapted accordingly. Military surveys, agency topographic maps, and hydrographic charts began to separate perennial lakes from playas and salt pans. Symbols for marshy ground, salt playa, and ephemeral lake took the place of the older inland sea fills. New editions of atlases and state maps corrected the older conventions. The Timpanogos Lake of Mira's Plate and the speculative Western Sea were revised, trimmed, or removed as field data accumulated. Yet even as maps corrected themselves, the mythic language persisted in travel accounts and in the popular press. Writers used the conceit of sailing a salt sea to dramatize the desert's illusions. Other regions of the world produced parallel stories. The high plains of Bolivia hold the Sala de Uyuni, the world's largest salt flat, a remnant of ancient lakes such as Minchin and Talca. When seasonal rains flood the Sala, the thin water layer produces a flawless mirror that erases the horizon. Visitors speak of walking on reflected sky. Explorers of earlier eras did not attempt to launch oceanic vessels there, but the visual effect is similar. The salt surface conflates land and water, producing optical effects that can disorient observers. The existence of such landscapes worldwide helps explain why people in different eras and places read salt for sea, especially before instrumented verification became standard. By the time motor vehicle culture arrived in the 20th century, the Bonneville Flats found a new, non-nautical use. The same flatness that once suggested navigation made the plain one of the world's great stages for high-speed land records. Pack salt allows for long, straight runs. Racers and engineers chose the Bonneville Speedway for its unusual combination of length, level, and firm surface. The fleet that traverses the basin today are race cars, not brigantines, and the maps that once promised seas now guide event logistics, safety planning, and conservation decisions. Meanwhile, industrial interest in the brine beneath the crust, potash, and, more recently, interest tied to lithium and other minerals, introduced another set of pressures that required careful mapping, environmental impact assessment, and monitoring. Ecologically, the The salt flats host life adapted to extremes. Halophiles, brine shrimp, and migratory shorebirds exploit seasonal puddles and microhabitats. Researchers monitor biological communities and the effects of industrial extraction. Remote sensing tools, satellite imagery, LiDAR, and airborne photography now map subtle microtopography, salt polygon patterns, and the margins of occasional flooding with centimeter precision. The data inform conservation and recreational management while also erasing the old map-scale illusions that once led men to imagine ships crossing the reflected plane. That history of correction, field men observing, scientists analyzing, mapmakers re-engraving, tells a consistent lesson. Perception is a necessary starting point, but persistent mapping requires verification. The Spanish plates that sketched a navigable salt sea depended on observers without the tools to measure seasonal variability. Later disciplines supplied those tools, replacing an evocative but inaccurate image with a more complex, dynamic, and ultimately truer cartography. The modern era leaves little room for mistaking the Bonneville salt flats for a permanent inland sea, but it has not made the landscape less remarkable. Several federal and state agencies now manage the basin with layered responsibilities. The Bureau of Land Management oversees recreational and racing uses. The Utah Geological Survey tracks salt crust thickness and hydrologic changes, and the U.S. Geological Survey publishes research on evaporation, sediment transport, and crustal loss. These agencies combine field sampling with remote sensing to produce maps and data sets that show the flats as a functionally dry playa with periodic inundation rather than a navigable lake. Contemporary topographic data sets place the flats precisely in relation to Great Salt Lake, Pilot Valley, and adjacent basins, clarifying the hydrologic separations that confused earlier observers. Geoscience also shows how variable the land can be. Stratigraphic cores document alternating episodes of salt deposition and dilution, tied to climatic cycles. Studies of polygonal crust patterns reveal shrink and swell cycles driven by brine concentration and evaporation. Sediment layers record flood events. Trace mineral analysis illuminates provenance of salts. The Bonneville flood, an enormous rapid outflow event when the prehistoric lake overtopped and breached its outlet, left terraces and scour features that are now part of geomorphologists' case studies. All of these physical traces become a new kind of map. Not ink on paper, but stratigraphic and geophysical datasets that reveal the area's deep history. Cultural memory remains lively. Historic maps with their inland seas are preserved in libraries and online repositories. Travel narratives and indigenous oral histories complement technical datasets. The Ute and Shoshone people who traversed and managed the broader region encoded seasonal knowledge, where wetlands would appear, which playas supported birds, where brine pools would be dangerous, into place names and ceremonial routes. Those layers of local knowledge were often overlooked by early European mapmakers, but modern collaborative mapping projects increasingly work to integrate indigenous place names and long-term observations into official land management and interpretive materials. Economics now drives some mapping priorities. Brine extraction for potassium and other salts requires accurate, current maps of fluid extents and subsurface reservoirs. Racers and recreational users require maps of crust firmness and surface continuity. Conservation programs depend on high-resolution remote sensing to monitor habitat for migrating birds and to gauge the environmental footprint of events. Each use case demands a different kind of map, and the suite of maps together gives a fuller picture than any single 18th or 19th century engraving could. That plurality of representations is itself a modern answer to the earlier problem of overconfident, singular images on engraved plates. Internationally, salt plains such as Bolivia's Sala de Uyuni and Chile's Sala de Atacama expose the same visual phenomena: large, luminous flats that, in certain seasons, become shallow mirrors. These places do not typically prompt shipbuilding fantasies, but they do challenge perception in ways similar to the Bonneville story. Remote sensing makes clear the seasonal cycles, while geochemistry and sedimentology reveal the ancient lake basins that once filled these bowls. In each case, the modern archive combines field measurements, aerial and satellite imagery, and long-term monitoring to produce maps that are both practical and truthful. Maps remain instruments of authority, but the authority now rests on layered verification. Fieldwork, laboratory analysis, remote sensing, and local knowledge. The era when a single printed plate could assert the existence of a lake to sail in the interior of a continent has passed, replaced by datasets that quantify fluctuation, capture ephemeral ponds, and mark salt pans precisely. The old maps are still useful. They document how perception once functioned and how narratives formed. We can read them as artifacts of knowledge and process, not only as mistaken claims. And now, as you rest where you are, let the image settle into the quiet of your room. The white plain stretched under a broad sky, a flash of sunlight turned into a shimmer that once read like water to men on horseback. The modern map shows no place to launch a ship there. It shows salt, brine pools, and contours measured to the centimeter. But that earlier misreading matters. It shows how people and instruments together build the world on the page. Let that sense of construction fall away into a slow inhalation and exhalation. Feel your breath match the hush of wind over a salt plain, steady and even. Allow the thought of a glittering, impossible sea of salt to become a calm image at the edge of sleep. Good night. Hi guys. Tonight's journey takes us to the Atlantic coast of Europe, to a city that built its wealth on waves and ships, yet strangely turned its face away from the sea. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Imagine the sound of waves rolling in on stone quays, the distant call of gulls circling above, and the faint sigh of wind moving across tiled rooftops. Let that maritime rhythm steady your breathing. Each inhale like the tide pushing forward, each exhale like the tide slipping away. We'll walk slowly into a city that thrived on the ocean, but did not face it. The city is Lisbon, Portugal. Today we know it as one of Europe's great maritime capitals, the launching point for voyages that reshaped the world in the 15th and 16th centuries. But Lisbon carries a paradox. It became the center of a sea empire while physically and symbolically turning its back on the ocean. Streets rose inland, plazas faced away from the river, and the heart of civic life was set not on the waterfront but deep among the hills. To understand this reversal, we have to wander backward in time through geography, history, fear, and culture. Lisbon sits on the northern bank of the Tagus River estuary, one of the widest natural harbors in Europe. At its mouth, the river broadens to nearly 10 miles across, creating a natural deepwater roadstead where ships can anchor in safety, shielded from Atlantic storms. For mariners, this was a blessing. The estuary gave shelter yet offered easy access to the sea. But for city builders, the geography was less welcoming. The land rises sharply from the shore, climbing into a series of ridges and valleys. Narrow hills forced the medieval city to grow vertically, like stacked terraces, rather than outward across a flat plain. That topography meant the waterfront was always at the edge of urban life rather than at its center. The medieval origins of Lisbon reinforced this pattern. When Christian forces captured the city from Moorish control in 1147, they inherited a walled settlement whose gates faced inland toward the agricultural hinterlands. Fortifications emphasized protection against land-based attack rather than naval assault. The ocean was a route of trade, but also of danger. Raiders from North Africa, pirates from the Barbary coast, and rival fleets could all strike suddenly. Turning the city inward was both practical and defensive. By the 13th and 14th centuries, Lisbon's waterfront was alive with shipyards, fish markets, and warehouses. But this was a working zone, not a ceremonial one. Narrow alleys led down to the docks, cluttered with barrels of salted cod, coils of rope, and the shouts of sailors. The nobility and clergy, however, kept their palaces, monasteries, and plazas further inland on the ridges. Commerce and labor occupied the riverfront, while prestige and governance looked away. The contrast becomes clearer when we compare Lisbon with Venice. In Venice, the sea was a stage for civic theater. Processions floated across the lagoon, and the Piazza San Marco opened directly to the water. Amsterdam, too, in its golden age, built canals that intertwined commerce and domestic life. Lisbon, by contrast, allowed the river to be functional rather than symbolic. It was a backstage corridor for goods and departures, not a front door for collective identity. Still, the sea shaped Lisbon's destiny. In the 15th century, Prince Henry the Navigator and the Portuguese crown began sponsoring voyages down the coast of Africa. By the late 1400s, explorers like Bartholomew Dias had rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and Vasco da Gama had sailed to India. Lisbon became the hub of a global empire, receiving pepper from the Indies, sugar from Brazil, gold from West Africa, and later silver from the Americas. Ships crowded the Tagus with their masts rising like forests, but the city streets still twisted uphill, where merchants and courtiers lived among plazas oriented inward. It is worth pausing here to imagine the sight. A merchant returning from Goa might disembark at the Ribera docks, step past the shouting porters unloading cinnamon, and then climb through crooked lanes toward his townhouse. From his window he might see tiled rooftops, the spire of a church, or a courtyard with orange trees, but not the river that had carried his fortune home. Lisbon's prosperity came from the sea, yet the city's eyes seldom looked at it directly. This paradox also reflected a cultural view of the ocean. For Portugal, the sea was a path outward rather than a space to be celebrated domestically. It was the place of departure and return, not a civic mirror. The great symbols of Lisbon's power were not waterfront piazzas but inland monuments. The Geronimo's Monastery, the Castelo de São Jorge, the Praça do Rocio. Even the royal palace before 1755 faced inland, not outward. The Tagus served, but it was not glorified. And then came disaster. On November 1st, 1755, Lisbon was struck by one of the most powerful earthquakes in European history, followed by a tsunami that surged up the Tagus. Much of the medieval city was destroyed. In rebuilding, the Marquis of Pombal imposed a new rational street grid in the Baixa district, closer to the river. The Praça do Comércio was laid out as a grand square along the waterfront, but even here the orientation pointed inward, toward the triumphal arch leading into the city, not outward toward the sea. The reconstruction demonstrated Lisbon's resilience and modernity, yet it still maintained the habit of turning its ceremonial face away from the ocean. So why did Lisbon persist in this peculiar stance? Part of the answer lies in habit. Centuries of development locked into the hills. Part lies in fear of raids, storms, and disasters. And part lies in symbolism. For Lisbon's rulers, power was displayed inland, toward subjects, not outward toward the horizon. The result is a city forever tied to the sea in its economy and history, but strangely indifferent to it in its physical orientation. Even today, when tourists arrive in Lisbon, they may be surprised to find themselves walking through streets that seem more Mediterranean than maritime. Yes, the Tagus sparkles nearby, but the daily life of neighborhoods like Alfama, Barro Alto, and Chiado revolves around plazas, stairways, and courtyards perched above the water. The sea is always present, but always peripheral. Lisbon's relationship with the sea was one of necessity, not intimacy. For centuries, the Tagus River had carried ships to and from the Atlantic, but the city's daily life rarely spilled into the harbor itself. Unlike Venice, where canals formed the very arteries of the city, Lisbon placed its heart away from the water. The narrow medieval lanes, winding uphill into neighborhoods like Alfama and Moraria, spoke of defense and enclosure rather than openness. People lived with their backs to the sea not only in architecture, but in the rhythm of life. Fishmongers might shout on the quays, and shipwrights hammered in the yards. Yet the true pulse of Lisbon beat inland in its plazas, its churches, and the tight web of streets where markets, guilds, and homes pressed together. To look toward the sea was to look toward danger, storms, and the long absence of husbands and sons. To look inland was to look toward safety and community. This arrangement had practical roots. The Tagus estuary was wide, but it was shallow in places and subject to silting. Storms sometimes pushed Atlantic swells upriver, flooding wharves and drowning warehouses. The safest ground was uphill on the rocky ridges that framed the city. Settlements grew dense in these higher quarters, away from the marshy riverfront. For everyday Lisbon, the waterfront was a working zone, not a living space. The quays might be bustling with sailors and stevedores, but by evening, families had retreated into the hills, their lamps flickering in sheltered streets. And yet, from the 15th century onward, the sea gave Lisbon its power. When Prince Henry the Navigator urged sailors south along the coast of Africa, Lisbon became the point of departure. Ships returned with sugar, ivory, and eventually enslaved people, changing the wealth and the character of the city. By the early 1500s, spices from India poured into the warehouses of the Ribera district. Caravels and nos crowded the quays, their masts of forest against the sky. Still, even at the height of maritime empire, Lisbon's grand avenues pointed inland. The Praça do Comércio, the great riverside square rebuilt after 1755, opened ceremoniously toward the city, not toward the Tagus. Visitors arriving by ship disembarked into a space that immediately directed their gaze back uphill, into the civic and royal heart of Lisbon, as if to remind them that true authority did not rest with the waves. This turning inward reflected not only geography but also memory. In November 1755, Lisbon was struck by one of the deadliest earthquakes in European history. A powerful tremor leveled much of the city, but it was the sea that delivered the cruelest blows. A tsunami surged up the Tagus, sweeping away thousands who had fled to the waterfront in search of safety. Fires broke out across the ruins, consuming what little had been left standing. Survivors spoke for generations of the moment when the ocean rose against them. That trauma confirmed an attitude already centuries in the making. The sea could enrich Lisbon, but it could not be trusted. This mindset contrasted sharply with other maritime powers. Genoa and Venice flaunted their ports, their palaces reflected in lagoons and harbors. Amsterdam later built concentric rings of canals that tied every district to trade. Lisbon, by contrast, let the sea remain a threshold rather than an embrace. Its empire depended on sailors, yet its citizens preferred to build their lives facing each other, not the water. It was a city that took from the sea, but rarely gave its heart to it. Even the architecture reinforced this separation. Walk along the Alfama's steep lanes, and the Tagus seems distant, glimpsed only in slivers between tiled facades. Churches stood proudly above the waterfront, as if to claim spiritual guardianship against the threatening horizon. The Sé Cathedral, founded in the 12th century, was fortress-like, its towers turned inland. Lisbon's defenses historically faced not outward toward naval enemies but inward, against rebellions and fires that spread through its labyrinthine streets. In such a city, the sea was less a neighbor than a supplier vital, but kept at arm's length. At the same time, Lisbon never fully severed its dependence. Its economy thrived on goods that came across the Tagus. The Ribeira Palace, the residence of Portuguese kings before the earthquake, sat near the waterfront, allowing rulers to oversee the loading and unloading of treasure fleets. Chroniclers describe chests of gold from Brazil carried across the square, perfuming the city with the scent of wealth. Yet beyond these ceremonial moments, Lisbonites lived their daily lives apart from the wharves. Sailors might have drunk in taverns by the river, but the merchants and officials who financed them walked the safer streets uphill, away from the spray of the Atlantic winds. To modernize, this separation seems puzzling. In the age of tourism, Lisbon's riverfront draws visitors with open terraces and promenades. But for centuries, the water's edge was a working zone, not a leisure space. Ships were outfitted there, supplies stacked, goods tallied. The Tagus was noisy, dangerous, and unpredictable. Children were warned not to stray too close. To live by the sea was to court risk, and so the city built its beauty inland. Tiled facades, shaded plazas, and miraduros, the lookout points that gazed not only at the river, but at the hills and valleys that rolled away behind it. Perhaps the most striking sign of Lisbon's turn back is how it absorbed empire's riches without absorbing empire's geography. The spices of Goa, the gold of Brazil, the silver of Japan all entered through its port. Yet the city's urban shape remained that of a hilltop town wary of exposure. Streets stayed narrow, twisting, defensive. Even after the grand rebuilding of the 18th century introduced wider boulevards, the pattern persisted. Lisbon's face was toward its people, not its water. The sea remained a servant, not a partner. When one compares Lisbon to other maritime capitals, the difference is stark. Venice thrived on a lagoon that shaped every element of its culture. Amsterdam's canals created a maritime city on land. London developed along the Thames, tying its growth to docks and warehouses. Lisbon, however, rose from hills above the Tagus, leaning away from the water. It was as though the city accepted the gifts of the ocean but declined its company at the table. And yet, the irony remains that Lisbon's fate was always bound to the sea. Without the caravels that departed its quays, Portugal's golden age would not have dawned. Without the estuary, its merchants would not have controlled spice and sugar routes. Even its tragedies came from the ocean, from tsunamis and storms. The city could look inland all it liked, but the waves still carried its fortune. By the 19th century, the logic of Rio's inland-facing streets was becoming harder to sustain. Steamships were faster, larger, and required proper docking facilities. International trade was accelerating, and coastal ports across the globe were being reshaped to welcome an age of industrial maritime power. Yet Rio still clung to its colonial layout, where the most important thoroughfares led away from the water. The harbor front had become cramped, with makeshift wharves that were too shallow and streets that could not handle the flow of carts, carriages, and later, rail traffic. Merchants complained of bottlenecks. Sailors arriving from Europe sometimes spent days waiting for their cargoes to be unloaded because there was no efficient way to process the ships. What had once been a defensive strength now looked like an economic weakness. The city could no longer afford to pretend the sea was secondary. This tension reached a breaking point at the turn of the 20th century, when Brazil's leaders pushed through an ambitious set of modernization reforms. The most visible was the Pereira Passos reform program, a massive urban overhaul that sought to transform Rio into a capital that could rival Paris. Old colonial streets were widened, boulevards cut through the dense downtown, and, most importantly, the port itself was rebuilt. Warehouses, stone quays, and dredged channels reshaped the city's relationship with the ocean. At last, Rio had a waterfront that faced outward, ready to meet steamship traffic head-on. But the irony was that by the time Rio truly embraced the sea, its street plan had already set in stone centuries of habits. To this day, much of the urban core still angles away from the water, echoing choices made in the 16th century. The inland focus had cultural effects as well. Unlike New York, where neighborhoods spilled out toward the piers, or Lisbon, where riverside squares dominated civic life, Rio developed a culture that treated the sea as something peripheral. Beaches, which would later become world famous, were initially ignored. For centuries, Cariocas, the people of Rio, saw the sand as an inconvenient margin, a place for fishermen and laborers, not leisure. Only in the late 19th century did the idea of bathing culture take root, and even then it was resisted by elites who considered the beach unsanitary. In that sense, the city's reluctance to orient itself toward the water extended well beyond urban planning. It was a state of mind. Yet the paradox remains. A city that owed its birth, wealth, and survival to the Atlantic Ocean spent centuries pretending it lived inland. To understand this, one must remember that cities are not always built with long-term logic. They are shaped by fears, by the needs of rulers, and by immediate practicalities. When Rio was founded, safety outweighed visibility. Later, when gold and sugar flowed through its warehouses, secrecy and control outweighed convenience. Only much later, in a modern age of global commerce, did openness to the sea become unavoidable. By then, Rio's cultural and physical landscape had been imprinted with centuries of looking the other way. What makes Rio's story especially striking is how unusual it is. Most coastal capitals grew up with their faces pressed to the water. Venice spread outward in a lagoon. Amsterdam dug canals to connect every warehouse directly to shipping routes. London expanded its docklands into a sprawling complex of basins and locks. Rio, by contrast, kept its main avenues facing inland hills, its plazas tucked away from the bay, and its residents more concerned with what happened inside the city than with what ships carried to and from its port. The contrast was not just geographical but symbolic. Where other cities celebrated maritime power as a mark of prestige, Rio seemed to conceal it. Even today, you can sense this history in the way Rio's neighborhoods flow. Downtown remains relatively disconnected from the waterfront, separated by layers of traffic, elevated roads, and industrial zones that act as barriers. The grand plazas of the city are inland rather than coastal. Tourists marvel at the beaches of Copacabana and Ipanema, but those are modern inventions of culture, not original foundations. The original city was built to turn away. That orientation continues to shape how residents interact with their surroundings, even in a metropolis famous for its shoreline. And so, the story of Rio de Janeiro's inland-facing streets becomes more than just a quirk of design. It is a reminder of how geography, power, and fear intertwine to guide human decisions. A city that once feared Dutch cannons ended up living with streets that concealed its own best advantage. Over time, those choices hardened into traditions and then into culture, until the shoreline itself seemed secondary. Cities, after all, are like palimpsests. Layers of choices, mistakes, and necessities etched into the stone and street plans, never fully erased. As you drift now toward rest, think of that strange paradox. A city that owed its lifeblood to the sea once chose to pretend the sea was not there. It grew into greatness with its back turned, and even today its streets carry the echo of that decision. Like the tide, history shapes the edges of every city, washing up habits, fears, and unexpected legacies. And perhaps, as you sleep, you can imagine wandering those streets yourself. A gentle walk inland, the sound of waves muted behind you, the scent of salt in the air, and the knowledge that just beyond the walls and hills lies the ocean, waiting quietly, patient as always.